Welcome to part 17 of the mod making series for locked loot containers. In this one, I didn't really get any programming done, and I didn't really... Well, I did have plans to do it, but I don't know. The time just flew away today, and I was like, oh, okay, well, it's already 10 p.m., almost 9 p.m., so I'm like, alright, forget it then. Forget the idea of doing any coding today. But I did do, some other planning stuff, so I pretty much decided what I'm going to do in terms of, the order of, I guess, priorities, sort of, for the upcoming features for this mod. So, at least, these are the ones that I have down right now. So, right now, the first thing that I'm going, well, after I've just done the stuff I did, in the last episode and such, or in the previous episodes, whatever, the next thing I'm going to be working on is stuff like, or, well, the order operations for the generation of the chests, and what they are, and the context and all that stuff. First thing I'm going to work on is generating the chest based on generating the chest and their properties based on context and other variables and such. So basically, like, what material the chests will be made out of, what their lock difficulty will be, what their lock material will be, what other characteristics like that, what their lock difficulty will be, and all that. And that will happen first, before the next thing, which would be the actual generation of the loot, which would then, based on that, change the value of the loot generated inside of it. So at least that's the order of operations that because, you know, there's obviously going to be a place where it starts, and then where something else happens afterward, and then where something else happens afterward. There has to be something that follows beforehand for these things, unless you just have them all predetermined. But since we're going to be generating them on the fly, based on various things, we have to have a kind of, like, order of operations. But yeah, in this case, it's going to be generating the chest, and it's what material it is, what its various, like, lock difficulty and stuff like that is, based on whatever context it's in and all that, whatever dungeon type it's in and everything. And then after that's done, generate the loot based on those variables as well, including the actual properties of the chest. And then after the loot is generated, that's when other properties and aspects will be generated, as well as primarily here being stuff like potentially traps, when those, when and how many of those and what type of those will be generated in the chest, based on, once again, the similar context, the dungeon type, the value of the chest, the materials, all these other things. So it'll be like that, then loot generation, then traps after all that's kind of said and done, and then possibly minor modifications to the loot based on traps afterward, possibly, or additions, whatever. But for right now, loot generation first and everything. So, but that means the first thing I plan on working on now, in terms of the next thing I want to work on in code when I do some coding, hopefully like tomorrow, is basically implementing the sort of different material types for a chest, the different difficulties for locks, or whatever kind of thing, like the different values of difficulties, and different materials for the locks themselves and the chests, what those things mean, what their modifiers kind of are for each, what the various characteristics for each different material are, and everything like that, what the rarity is, stuff such as that. But that's the sort of order operations I've kind of come up with. And with that, I did actually get a little bit of work done today, in this case with a bit of planning more than anything. Which, at least to me, I find is, it's not, like, people can get, paralyzed, almost, like analysis paralysis. They can get paralyzed by the planning process and use that as a, you know I've done this, and I know I do this, that I can use that as a procrastination, kind of, an excuse to procrastinate in a way, by doing too much planning and not enough just doing. Like, even if you don't have the whole thing or whatever planned out 100%, you really should, at least I think, you really should try to at least do something, like something of the practical purpose besides the planning part, because otherwise, as I said, it's very easy to get the analysis paralysis. It's very easy to procrastinate and make an excuse for yourself to procrastinate with the planning process instead of just doing it. And then you get stuck in the planning phase, and then you never really get anywhere. But in this case, I think I'm using it for, you know, a pretty practical purpose. And I used a spreadsheet because I'm not very good at making spreadsheets, but I like to use them because they're a very decent visual way to look at stuff that you've kind of planned out and such. But yeah, in this case, I used the sort of template that I had already for another planning thing that I was working on for a big overhaul thing that I had, it's like a few years ago that I kind of dropped, but I learned a lot from it, at least at the time. But I did a bunch of that kind of planning, too much planning stuff then. And I made some spreadsheets here and there, just simple spreadsheets. And in this case, I just kind of reused and changed some stuff to use for this purpose in this case. And so for this spreadsheet that I did today, at least, or whatever, this part of this spreadsheet I did today, I decided to try to suss out and make some sense of the various materials that the chest and the locks are going to be made out of, or can be made out of, and the various aspects of each of those materials, what their differences are, what their rarity is, what their various properties are, and everything. So yeah, so instead of having all the materials that there are in the game, like every metal material that there is in the game, I decided just to stick with 7 out of, I think, the 10, and add another one that isn't there, that being this wooden one. So there's currently, at least in this planning phase, 8 materials I plan on using for chest and locks. If that's, you know, if that hasn't been clear, is that the chests are going to generate potentially with a different material themselves than the lock that is on the chest. So, like, you know, you could potentially have a chest that is very flimsy with a decent lock. You know, a fairly well-made lock. Even if that's going to be fairly, like, uncommon sort of stuff. Or the other way around, you could have a very well-made chest with a very not well-made lock kind of thing. You know, I'll obviously have to see, but I'm kind of hoping that it works out the way I'm trying to make it work here. But so in this case, I have the 8 materials. I have these 8 materials. I have this new one, wooden, and then iron, steel, orcish, mithril, dwarven, adamantium, and daedric. And the reason I picked these is because the other ones, I don't know, they just, the way that I looked at them, I was like, okay, so ebony, elven, and silver, even though the weight modifiers in the game are kind of messed up or kind of weird, I kind of look at it like ebony, elven, and silver are very light, probably fairly soft materials to some extent. So I was like, they probably wouldn't make very good material to make something like a container out of, or a chest that you're trying to keep. You're generally trying to keep things out of. So I was like, okay, let's just get rid of those so I can make it easier on myself. And then I stuck with these 8 here. But yeah, I mean, I don't have to explain like every single one, but basically wooden is gonna be the like the most common, or the yeah, the most common or the least rare one that you could find. Iron second least rare, steel third, mithril fourth, orcish fifth, um adamantium sixth, dwarven seventh, and then daedric eighth for the most rare. And at least at the moment, these value modifiers are completely just like placeholder, but it's kind of generally the idea I'm going for is like the more rare it is made out of, probably the more valuable the stuff inside of it is going to be, and to some extent, even if I didn't make it so the quote unquote difficulty is like linear here for each one. Like in this case, I made it so, okay, so the sturdiness would be like what the basically the physical durability of the material is against stuff like, you know, bashing or other kind of physical trauma and stuff. So I was like, okay, so wooden is probably going to be the weakest, obviously. But I wanted to make it so there's some variance. So there's going to be like a random number generation that happens when during this generating phase and stuff. And at least right now, I'm looking at it like, okay, let's make a modifier for this of like plus or minus 20, down to a minimum of 1 and then a maximum of 100. And the idea of that being like, you know, maybe it's an old chest, maybe it's a brand new chest, or maybe it's something that's made out of a slightly better material, or is better craftsmanship, worse craftsmanship, that sort of thing. Like maybe you have a wooden chest that has a durability, a condition of, or a sturdiness of 1, being like, oh, okay, so it's like a rotten, waterlogged, like beaten the hell out of chest that would be like completely unstable or whatever, completely easy to just punch a hole through kind of thing. Or maybe then you could have a chest that has like, I don't know, it's made out of some hard wood, like I don't know, apple or cherry, I don't know, whatever woods, whatever hard woods there are, or it's made well and stuff like that. And the same deal with all the other things, all the other materials in the same sense. But and then with that, you have on the other extreme, like from wooden, you have orcish, which, at least in my mind, like orcish would probably be the one of the heaviest, most sturdy kind of non-magic material, whatever, like just pure like craftsmanship metal, whatever, heavy and sturdy kind of thing. So I was like, okay, so this potentially could, as a value of 80 from 0 to 100, like if it had a modifier of 20 added to it, then it could be like basically impervious almost to physical trauma. So it's like you'd never be able to break it open with physical force almost. You know, I don't know how I'll do that exactly, but practically that's the idea. And then the other ones that are like, that I kind of determined was like, okay, so orcish, then steel would be like below that generally, and then iron. But then you have other stuff like in between, like mithril is actually slightly better than, more sturdy than steel, but it's less than orcish. Dwarven, worse than steel, but better than iron. Adamantium actually worse than iron. But that's going to come into a factor later, or afterward. And then daedric is kind of just like generally very good, but it's slightly worse than the best, slightly better than the, slightly worse than the best kind of thing. Due to its, I don't know, its magical nature or whatever. That's just how I look at it. And then you have something like magic resistance, which I don't know if eventually I'm going to do like specific element resistances, which I might, but it's kind of annoying because there's like, you know, 5 different elements technically. You got magic, shock, fire, ice, and toxic or whatever, poison. And even though that wouldn't be too big of a deal to do, it'd be like, you know, maybe it's overkill. But at the very least, I'd probably want something like Daedric to be impervious to like fire damage, like that sort of thing. But the idea being that like, okay, so the less sturdy materials, in this case, something like adamantium, even that like they're rarer, but they're still practically used as a chest because they're actually very magic resistant. Like in this case, 90 out of 90 out of 100 with a modifier of plus or minus 10 would practically probably make it almost impossible to open with a open spell or something like that. Or hit with magic and try to blow it up with magic. I don't know, some stuff like that. And the same kind of deal that like Dwarven is more resistant to that, Mithril's more resistant, even though they're less sturdy than the other Iron, Steel, and Orcish and such. Try and kind of, you know, quote unquote balance them out here and there, but make them all a little bit different. And then this one I'll have to consider more, but the min and max lock complexity that certain materials can have, like I don't know, like how complex can you really make a wooden lock at the end of the day? So I'm just like, okay, so the minimum that a wooden lock could have would be like a complexity of 1, you know, from 1 to 100 most likely, and then the maximum it could have is like 30. And then for iron, it's like 10 minimum and then 50 maximum. Steel, 25 minimum, 85 maximum, and then the other ones, it's like, okay, so 100, maximum, but then stuff like Dwarven is the outlier here, where it has a much higher min than the rest. That, the idea being, I guess, that, like, you know, maybe Dwarven material, it's actually like a Dwarven mechanism, and it's very complex and, like, arcane compared to other things due to its Dwarven nature. I don't know. Just the idea there. And then this other one, since I mentioned the the jamming thing, I think I remember that I was planning on doing as a feature that, basically, if you fail too many times, like that would kind of be the way to determine how many times attempts you have to lock, to try and pick the lock of a chest's lock, would be if it jams or not. So like, you know, some chest or some locks on chest, they might you know, as you would kind of expect with something that is made of certain materials, would probably have different properties to jam up or become corroded and rusted and just stop moving after being used or something. At least, you know, me doing the work that I've done in the jobs that I've worked and such, it's like, yeah, stuff that corrodes, like, depending on the material and stuff, can make it completely, almost like practically impossible to move after a point if it's like corroded enough or whatever kind of happens, just whatever material it's made out of. And that's the idea here, is that like, okay, so maybe wood is not something that is that corrosion, it's not something that would be like that likely to be like rusted or something like that, because it's wood. So it has like a corrosion resistance of 30. So it's like, it's not bad, but it's not amazing. Or not quote unquote corrosion here, but just like jam resistance. Like the lock won't jam. So you have you'll have more odds to be able to do more attempts to lockpick it before it potentially jams, and then you have to open it up by force after that point. But then something like iron has a very low jam resistance, because, you know, iron is well known to oxidize, or whatever you want to call it, rust. So I would imagine that an iron lock would have a pretty good chance to, depending on its environment or whatever, it would probably be rusted up, and then it might not move at all if you after you tried once or something like that, and then it jams up after that. So even if they have generally simpler locks, is that, hey, well, if you the trade-off there is that, hey, well, it might jam up more. But then something like I don't know, adamantium, I was just kind of like trying to balance out the numbers a little bit, but you know, adamantium is, I don't know, some softer, less corrosive material because of corroded material because of its magical properties or something, so it doesn't jam up very often. So it's like a high resistance to that, and same with Daedric, and fairly high with Dwarven because of its whatever properties, that sort of thing. And then with all that, like I said, it did the rarities and the values. Most of these, obviously, like, placeholder, but, and they need to be sussed out more in the end. But for right now, I think it's a good, something that will help me determine these values more and have an idea of what I want to do with them in the end. Like, but yeah, this is just a huge rambly video that I didn't do much, but this is right now my planning process for the specifics of this kind of stuff. And I'm gonna do the same thing with like the loot, most likely, and the different things for the dungeon types, whatever kind of modifiers and context-based stuff I want to change it with, like later on, such as dungeon types might have different modifiers to their traps, how often traps are generated, what kind of traps are generated, what kind of locks are in there, what kind of loot, what kind of chest, the context of a chest. Like some places might have more valuable stuff, so they'll have more complicated and sturdy chests. Others will have more simple chests but less value and everything. But that's how I'm doing this sort of thing right now. But yeah, I just wanted to get the daily video out with the progress of this, even if it wasn't coding specifically. And that's about it. So tomorrow, hopefully, I'll do some coding involving this stuff and getting some of this in there with like enum values and other stuff like that. But yeah, besides that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.